Calls for reparations grow louder across the Caribbean. Will the UK apologize and pay for the historical impact of slavery on former colonies in the West Indies? Or, as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says, is unpicking history not the right way forward? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the call for reparations. Slavery and violence defined British imperial control in the Caribbean. As early as 1629, the British brought people taken largely from West Africa and enslaved them to work on sugar plantations for hundreds of years. Now, that slavery funded the European Industrial Revolution, as well as its future wealth and development. The tiny island of Barbados became known as Little England and was one of Britain's most valuable colonies. An estimated 500,000 slaves were used there to farm and process sugarcane, known as white gold. The system of slavery in Barbados was so efficient, it was used to institute one of the first slave labor codes, a legal framework England then exported to other colonies, including the United States.
Barbados is the incubator. Barbados is the experiment that it could be done. So this island is unique, not only for its beauty and all the contemporary positive features, but this is where the greatest experiment in human terror in the modern era was first put in place in Barbados.
Now, almost 200 years since the abolition of slavery and 60 years after independence from the UK, Barbados has become a leading voice in the Caribbean movement for reparations. Years of hard work by activists and academics is gaining traction. A national reparations task force was created in 2012, followed by the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM's, groundbreaking 2014 reparations plan. And recently, Barbados made headlines for targeting wealthy Britons for individual reparations, including actor Benedict Cumberbatch and Member of Parliament Richard Drax, whose family still runs its 17th century plantation in Barbados. But in spite of the headlines, real progress is slow. In the U.S., 2 federal reparations bills have stalled. The Church of England has identified ways that one of its arms profited from enslavement and set aside a $120 million fund to address racial inequality. King Charles has agreed to a study of the monarchy's already documented ties to the slave trade, but Britain's new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has rejected calls for reparations. Meanwhile, the leader of Barbados says to ignore this is wrong.
And we feel that we have a moral obligation to be able to start to deconstruct the racism in all of its forms. It doesn't only come in laws that are still there, but it also comes in ways in which people undermine democracy, in ways in which people prevent people from voting, in ways in which people make judgments about people because of color or race. And we've got to work hard to deconstruct it. And we have to also recognize that when many countries became independent, there was no development compact or development package left for us to finance education, healthcare, or any of these issues. And we have to ask ourselves, can we accept that the Industrial Revolution was financed by the blood, sweat, and tears and money of developing countries, and at the same time causes the climate crisis today? And it's a case of double jeopardy. So we had the wealth taken from us, and now we are facing the consequences of that wealth's impact on the Earth's climate. It's wrong, just simply wrong.
So can reparations compensate for the torture of slavery as well as its damaging legacy? And if so, how can it be fairly applied? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, Esther Stanford-Xosei. She is Coordinator General of Stop the Maangamizi campaign, which works on getting the UK government to pass reparations bills. From Durham, North Carolina is William Darity Jr. He is a Samuel Dubois Cook Distinguished Professor at Duke University and also author of From Here to Equality. And from Norwich in the UK, David Campbell Bannerman is the chairman of the Freedom Association and the former Conservative member of European Parliament. Thanks all so much for being with me. William, I'll start with you. You know, it used to feel like the more time that passed, the less likely it was that substantial reparations would ever be kind of agreed to and properly distributed, but people seem to have real confidence in this Caribbean movement. Tell us, what's been your experience? What has it shown you? Do you think something will be agreed to here, and will it have an actual impact on communities today?
Well, I think the level of conversation in the present moment is more dramatic and profound than any level of discussion of this issue in my lifetime, and perhaps from the standpoint of the U.S. historical record since the Reconstruction era in the United States. So I think that the possibility lies out there for the establishment of comprehensive reparations to a degree that it has not in any previous moment.
Tell us, though, I mean, where have you seen, if at all, have you seen, models for reparations actually work? Where has it been effectively applied?
Well, there are a number of precedents, but perhaps the most significant precedents involve the German government's payment of reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, as well as payments that were made to the State of Israel. But also in the U.S. context, perhaps most notable is the payments that were made to Japanese Americans who had been subjected to mass incarceration by the United States government in the course of World War II.
Okay. Esther, let me turn to you. You are actually a citizen of Barbados. So I'd actually first like you to help us understand the legacy of slavery in Barbados from more of a personal standpoint, if you can. How does the damage, as well as the discrimination and racism, how does it manifest today? So much so that reparations are needed to properly address the wrongs.
So, one of the biggest areas of injury that has impacted people like myself is what's known as the injury of peoplehood and nationhood, in the sense that we are a dichotomized, dispersed people who now no longer carry the identities of our forebears, our foreparents, and who, as a result of that, experience varying degrees of not only statelessness, but also impacted citizenship, where citizenship is always a second or a third class citizenship, because there isn't a recognition yet about our own sovereignty as African human beings. We can be recognized as being minority ethnic people, or in the images of our colonial oppressors in terms of the nations that they have formed, but linking us to our true power base, which is a global power base, is something that is severely impacted. Anti-African sentiments, which is known as Afrophobia, anti-African prejudice and discrimination, is still very prevalent, even in the Caribbean, where there is huge amounts of colorism and discrimination based on your skin tone, your actual phenotype, how close you look to Europeans, or how close you are to your African heritage and ancestry.
Okay. Now, I know you are obviously a proponent of reparations. I want to come back to you in a minute about how you think reparations should be decided, whom they should be paid out to in a minute. But first, I need to get to David. And David, you need to tell us, why the idea of paying reparations for slavery is somewhat farcical to you.
Well, I think it's a ridiculous idea, I'm afraid. I mean, look, a lot of this is very historical. It's hundreds of years ago. And if you look at British history, you could go back and say, well, should we, be suing the Italians for Roman slaves, or suing the French for Norman slaves? I mean, the Saxon slaves actually built Durham Cathedral in England. So I just think the notion of this is nonsense. I mean, slavery is obviously horrible, and it was a horrible chapter, but a lot of horrible things happened hundreds of years ago. Being hung, drawn, and quartered for treason was one of them, for example. And I just think this is victimhood. It doesn't help anyone. And reparations don't have a happy history. They forced it on Germany after the First World War, and it led directly to the Second World War. It's not a happy instrument either.
But David, what about William's other examples of when reparations really have worked and they have given people a genuine sense of justice, not least Germany paying reparations and supporting those that suffered in the Holocaust post-World War II?
Well, I'm more sympathetic to that, but that's modern day. There's a living people. We're talking about there's no living slave traders, from hundreds of years ago, obviously. No, I am more sympathetic to that. I think they were very special measures after the war, and there was a special case because people were destitute because their homes had been stolen, and their families destroyed. So that I think was very different. But what we're talking about here is, going back to Caribbean slavery, and I think that's a very different case. A question I would ask, by the way, is: are you going to go after the African tribes who sold many of these slaves to the traders? And I'm very serious about this. The Foreign Secretary of Britain is from Ghana originally, and he was telling me that his family would ensure that the slave traders got their rival tribes, and sent them to the Caribbean. And it was a power struggle. And are they going to have to pay reparations as well? I mean, that's not clear.
Okay, William, I'll have you address this to begin with. Not only is this so far in the past, but the victimhood has almost become diluted over the centuries, according to David. And also, he seems to feel everyone was somehow complicit, including tribes back in West Africa.
Oh, I don't doubt the latter statement. I've thought about this more in the context of the United States, which is perhaps somewhat different from the Caribbean case. And I don't want to try to speak authoritatively about the Caribbean case. But in the United States, it's not just a question of the history of slavery as having an impact on the lives of descendants of individuals who were enslaved in the United States specifically. It's also a set of policies that were conducted by the United States government that maintained the capacity of white Americans to accumulate significant amounts of wealth to the disadvantage of Black Americans. One example is in the 19th century, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the federal government provides 1.5 million white households with 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories under the Homestead Act of 1862, approximately 10% of the white population in the United States. In contrast, Black Americans who emerged from slavery promised 40-acre land grants as restitution and did not receive those at all. In the 20th century, the federal government in the United States shifts away from asset building predicated on land distribution to home ownership. And then it does that in a highly discriminatory fashion, both through the phenomenon of redlining as well as the unfair application of the home buying provisions of the GI Bill in the aftermath of World War II. So we are not talking about the 19th century alone.
Right.
We are talking about a recent historical record.
Very recent. Many would argue it continues very strongly today. But let me come to Esther then, because David was obviously making the point that this is all history going hundreds of years back. And as I said, he seems to think it's been so diluted over the years that you can't really determine fairly who the actual victims are and who's responsible. Because again, everyone, he says, was complicit, including Africans themselves back in the slaves' native countries. So how do you determine really who should have to take responsibility?
Well, this is a matter of justice, okay? We can determine this. We haven't got the time to go into this program of all the research that's been done that can identify how the impact of wealth dispossession, landlessness continues to mar the lives of people of African heritage and ancestry in the Caribbean and across the diaspora. Now, when people are opposed to reparations and they say this is just about the past, it's because they are very, to be quite frank with you, ill-informed and uneducated as to what the arguments of reparationists are. So we base our claims to repair, let's use that language of repair, on the basis of the contemporary impacts of harmful actions and wrongdoings. When it is in the case in the UK, we were all paying back taxes that were generated as a result of the debt that was built up that paid enslavers, and the enslaved got nothing. This shows you that this is a contemporary reality. And this paying back of taxes happened, up until 2015. So it means myself, all of my family members were implicated in having to pay back a debt that was built up as a result of compensating people that enslaved my forebears. This is totally wrong. And the perspective of
Can I comment
reparationists
on
from
Andrea, please?
David, yeah, go ahead.
So, Esther, this country, Britain, actually stopped the slave trade, and it lost thousands of lives, soldiers and sailors, fighting the slave trade. And we only just paid off the debt in 2015. That's pretty contemporary.
That's
no,
what
You know,
that's
the
what she
actual
was saying, though.
no,
It was a
no,
debt
was
that
her
was
point.
to slave owners.
Actually, you're
to the
wrong. That
economy.
went to enslavers. Go and check
Yeah.
your facts. You are
Well,
totally
That was her point.
misinforming people.
respect.
Totally
I've
misinforming
been
people.
farmer for 10 years. I'm quite a well known on history, and
And so
sorry.
am I, with respect.
Yeah, and well,
Yeah. So the
you
point
know,
is, the British did
but
not.
other thing
The British,
is,
the British
sorry,
only do things in their
actually,
own self-interest.
don't talk over
Okay.
me.
And
It's very disrespectful. Can I just say, you're ignoring the fact the United Kingdom and the EU pay a lot of money in development aid to Barbados and the Caribbean, 75 million over 5 years. That's pounds, just Britain alone, but the EU does as well. So we do make a big contribution. We don't need reparations on top of that. And are you really happy with the victim culture where you're effectively enslaving people to handouts?
enslaving who?
And isn't that
Enslaving
just
who?
going back?
That's rich coming from you. I'm not enslaving anybody. And
Are
actually,
you just
let's
white
no. Hold
slaves?
on a second.
Or
Hold on a
just a
second. Hold on a
racial thing?
second.
Just white slaves as well?
If
What about
no,
1.2
no. What we're talking about are
European
those that experienced chattel
by Arab
slavery.
slaves? Arab slaves was the Arab
This
slave
is
trade.
Okay, I don't want to get too far off track. And like I said, when we speak over each other,
before-
it's very difficult to hear sometimes.
You're bringing in red herrings.
But
Red
David,
herrings.
yeah, David, I
you
mean,
can't
there
argue
is
the
an
point.
issue here
Putting it
with
in
the fact that
historical
the British
perspective.
government made the efforts and fulfilled this promise to pay back a debt to the slave owners themselves. This is actually true. That debt was finally finished being paid off in 2015. Yet, when it comes to paying back those who suffered the actual slavery and did the work, there is no compensation. So is your argument then that the UK government in other forms is kind of paying compensation by giving aid to countries like Barbados? Because they also, remember, they're not taking a handout necessarily. This is supposed to be development aid that helps with the infrastructure of schools, hospitals, and things that the country needs for its development after that was hindered through the institution of slavery.
There's an argument. If they were in Africa now, would they be better off? I mean, how are you going to calculate this? It gets very silly. That's the point. It's how do you calculate reparations?
Okay, let me just come back to William. Like I said, I want to give everybody equal time. William, I know you have some thoughts on what you've been hearing, so do go ahead.
Well, the statement that folks might have been better off being enslaved and then having their descendants live in the United States or in the Caribbean nations than having stayed in Africa is one of those comments where the bigotry is really.
How are you going to calculate it?
David, let William finish for a second, please.
Let me complete my comment. Okay,
please.
Let me complete my comment. That's the type of statement in which the bigotry is dripping off of someone's words like perspiration.
Yeah.
Let's keep in mind that the individuals who were coerced into migrating to the Americas did not choose to come to the Americas at their own volition. So it is not a matter of people who wanted to come to the United States or come to the Caribbean or come to South America being the folks who were imported. Instead, it was a situation in which a process of enslavement forced them to come. And so we have to start with that. We also have to consider the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the countries from which they originated. And so we have to construct a huge hyper counterfactual to be able to assess what the world would have been like in the absence of the slave trade, in the absence of imperialism and colonialism. And that's the story we have to tell for comparative purposes, rather than talking about what Africa looks like today.
Okay, I'll tell you
Also,
what.
keep in mind, now here, no, there's one more crucial point. The colonial powers systematically eliminated the African leaders who would have exercised the greatest degree of independence, starting with Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, with Deban Kimathi in Kenya, with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, with Prince Rwagasore in Burundi. And so, as a consequence, when we look at the African nations that exist today, we have to keep in mind that those are nations that are in their present form as a consequence of the extermination of the leaders who would have provided the greatest degree of creativity and independence.
Okay, Esther, we're down to our last few minutes, and there's so many angles to this that I think we need to do some justice to. I'll come back to you with this, Esther, because I know you actually, even though you support reparations, you are taking some serious issue with the process to get reparations to the people that you think deserve them. The problem is, would it not be simpler to allow these community claims to be made, to be the best way to get the results? Because if you start looking at these individual victims, you'll find people who are now so mixed in ethnically with even slave owners, victims that can't actually prove they're victims in a court of law. It could all get so diluted at that point and so tedious that no one wins. So should there be a simple as possible way to do this, to make sure that something is paid out?
Well, if we start with the notion of payment, that's really the wrong starting point for some of us. Reparations is about remedying wrong and harm. It includes restitution. Of course, compensation is there. But one of the key aspects of reparations are guarantees of non-repetition. And that is why in the UK, in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, we are calling for the establishment of the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, because we need to hear the voices of those who today are impacted because of the ignorance of some of the people in society who feel that this is all in history. And what we are also engaged in is hearing the solutions that communities are working on themselves that need to be amplified and supported, and that the restitution of our resources can go towards
can I just
actually
say,
rebuilding
I've
communities.
worked on trade deals, with Latin America, all around the world, through the EU and the UK as well. That is a far better way of helping the Caribbean, is fair trade. The EU actually slammed the brakes on sugar being imported into the UK, and the EU putting out massive tariffs and barriers. That is the way to go. And Africa is doing incredibly well, actually, economically. And I'm very much in favor of that. I would say far better to spend time on free trade and enterprise and investment, actually looking back hundreds of years and try to extract reparations. I just don't think it's a good way to go.
Let me get William in quickly with this question, because, I mean, David's primary point in some senses was the fact that everyone, if you go back historically, especially hundreds of years, everyone will owe someone something. Whether it's the Arabs in North Africa who've been asking the French for an apology for damage done in the Maghreb region, whether it's they owe the Berbers an apology. Some argue that they destroyed the language, the culture of the indigenous populations there. There are some who even do research into the Carib population, the indigenous population of the Caribbean that was taken out. So what do you say to that? How can you really determine who's a victim to whom?
So I think it's a question of doing the research and also saying that there may be multiple claims across the globe that many communities have for restitution, but that doesn't deny the claims that are being made in the present moment. I mean, consider the fact that Japanese Americans who were victimized during World War II did receive restitution from the US government. But there was no attempt at that time to say, well, there are other communities in the United States, like Black Americans, who merit restitution, even though that was the case. And I don't think that the Japanese American claim should have been disrupted by paying attention to claims that other communities had. It is time to meet the claim for the people who were subjected to slavery and colonialism across the globe. And any community that has a legitimate claim should come forward and make it. I don't have any hesitation about saying that there are other places besides the Bahamas that have legitimate claims on the United Kingdom. And
Okay.
so I just say, come forth with those claims, and let's resolve it.
David, I can see you clearly disagree, but that will have to unfortunately be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.